I'm here live on location with Dr. Trevor Tchir, an assistant professor of political science at Algoma University. And we're here to talk a little bit today about the notwithstanding clause, all the drama surrounding Bill 5 that Premier Doug Ford has gone about in Toronto. So as a political science expert, I wanted your opinion on what does this mean? What is the notwithstanding clause? How would you explain it to just an average everyday citizen?
Sure. Well, the notwithstanding clause came about in 1982 with the new Constitution Act. And what it was a way of compromising between the power of the courts to defend the rights in the new Charter of Rights and Freedoms and the powers of the provincial governments and federal government to pass laws and policies that they were elected to pass that reflect the will of the majority. And in practical terms, in the negotiations of 1981 that led to the new constitution, it was a deal really between Prime Minister Pierre Trudeau, who really loved that Charter of Rights and Freedoms, and 8 out of the 10 provinces that were really reluctant to have their powers limited by this new Charter of Rights and Freedoms.
So in how Premier Ford has tried to use this notwithstanding clause, how does it fall in line with the other times that it's been used in Canada? Because it has been used a few times, primarily in Quebec, based on what I've read. How does his interpretation of it compare to how it's been interpreted before?
Sure. It's really interesting if you look at the history of how it's been used before. The way that it works first is that there's a section in the Charter of Rights and Freedoms, Section 33, the Notwithstanding Clause, and it says that provincial and federal governments can pass policies and laws that do infringe on certain rights in the Charter. Those are Sections 2 and Sections 7 through 15, so that's fundamental freedoms, including the freedom of expression, and legal rights and equality rights. The provinces and the federal government can pass laws that infringe on these rights if they have good reason for it, and then policy or the law only lasts 5 years.
Okay. So there's a term on that.
There's a term on that. So they would have to reintroduce the law and policy after 5 years. By that time, there might be a new government that's been reelected. If people really don't like the policy that's been passed, they can decide not to reelect that government. When it was first introduced, the province of Quebec really did not like the notwithstanding clause. They thought that it was a power grab from the federal government and the Trudeau government, that limited the rights and the powers of the democratically elected Quebec government to pass laws and policies that it thought were good for the Quebec people. All right. And so as a matter of course and a matter of principle, the government of Quebec always cited the notwithstanding clause in every law and policy that it passed for the first few months after the notwithstanding clause was introduced. But after that, things toned down, and it was very rarely used after that year. The most famous case was also out of Quebec, in which Bill 101, the Charter of the French Language, was introduced citing the notwithstanding clause. And the thrust of that law was that it was encouraging French signage for businesses in Quebec and excluding the use of English signage inside and outside of the stores in Quebec. This is quite a different use of the notwithstanding clause. What Ford's trying to do is to limit the number of wards in the city of Toronto for electoral purposes from 47 down to 25. And a lot of people are pretty anxious about it because the election campaign is already underway. And so the critics of that move have said that it's a violation of the freedom of expression of the people running in those wards.
Now, so, the story's continually changing with what's happening in Toronto. Now, the most recent update is that the the courts essentially, they stayed the province's court or proceedings. So where does that leave the city of Toronto in terms of what they can do? Because Mayor John Tory said, the city lawyers have been given permission to take whatever means are necessary in order to continue to fight. But what means are left at this point?
There's essentially two options left for the province of Ontario. What happened was the initial law that was going to change the wards from 47 to 25 was called Bill 5. It did not mention the notwithstanding clause, all right?
Okay.
Then the Ontario Superior Court decided that's an unconstitutional law. It violates freedom of expression of the people running for office, all right?
Right.
And then what the appeal court did yesterday was they stayed that decision. So that allows the Ford government to go ahead with Bill 5 for the time being. And that same appeal court said, we're probably going to grant you an appeal, likely in November. By that time, the election's already happened.
Yeah.
All right. It's the same court that might grant the appeal as stayed the first decision. So it looks now like Ford won't even need to appeal to the notwithstanding clause, that the court's already said it might not be a fair law, or it might frustrate a lot of people running for office, but it's not unconstitutional.
So at this point, it seems as though Ford is going to get what he wanted out of the whole mission to cut Toronto's council.
At this point, yeah.
All right. Well, I have a couple more questions for you about what this means for councillors in Toronto and what the implications are for Ontarians in general. But we're going to take a short break, and we'll be right back with Dr. Trevor Tchir after this. We're back with Dr. Trevor Tchir talking politics, talking specifically about the notwithstanding clause and its implications. So you've explained a lot about what it is, how it works, and kind of painted a clearer picture of when it's been used historically. Something I've been kind of, mulling over in my head is this was never something that was stated in Premier Doug Ford's campaign trail. And that's something that critics have called him out on. Andrea Horwath mentioned it. Yeah. Other critics have mentioned it as well. What are the implications of that for, in terms of talking about informed voters and knowing platforms, like what does this kind of teach us in terms of even just a lesson?
Yeah, this is one of the critics that the NDP leader brought up yesterday, and really this was Ford's style of campaigning through the whole campaign a few months ago. He didn't have a costed platform, but it didn't hurt his results. He got quite a significant majority. And I think on one hand you could look at it and say he decided that this was a new idea that he had. I don't know if I believe that, but I don't want to get into speculation.
Right.
Really, you can make an argument saying not every big decision can appear in a platform ahead of time because circumstances change. I don't think this is one of those cases where circumstances have changed much, but he could just say this is this great idea just occurred to me. I think it's concerning when there's a lack of hard costed promises in a platform, and it's one of the criticisms of his brand of populism. And populism, among other things, is a kind of political style where the people really have a lot of faith in one leader's ability to reflect the will of the majority, and there's not often a kind of as much of a concern about having these plans clearly laid out in advance. The idea is that the leader rules by the will of the people rather than a kind of clearly laid out rational plan. That's at its extreme.
Right.
All right. Another element of populism is a kind of lack of patience with limits to power. And I think that's that's one interpretation that you can make out of reducing the number of wards in the province's capital and biggest city. That there are other political voices that might be limits to the power of the premier.
I think Ford has definitely shown some of these elements of populism that you learn about in school, which is he refers to the people as my friends, and this very relatable, approachable kind of guy.
Fight for the little guy.
Exactly. And I think
Sure.
that was a huge part of his platform.
Yeah, that can be really. I wouldn't even call it a part of it's not a policy,
Right.
But it's certainly a big part of his discourse and style
Yeah.
and messaging, and that can be very attractive to people who have felt disempowered.
Absolutely. Now, I want to kind of localize this issue a little bit because, this happened in Toronto and that's all well and good. But what does it mean for and people in Ontario in general that we have a premier that would go to such measures? Some people are calling it a personal vendetta against council. Some people are calling it, cutting budgets. No matter how you look at it, either way, it's intervening in municipal politics. So what does that mean for other municipalities in Ontario?
Well, the provinces do have constitutional jurisdiction over municipalities,
Right.
all right? What concerns me for the rest, and some people across Ontario will say this is a good move, it can save money, and so I'm all for it. It might be popular on that score. I think that.
We're back with Dr. Trevor Tchir talking politics, talking specifically about the notwithstanding clause and its implications. So we've explained a lot about what it is, how it works, and kind of painted a clearer picture of when it's been used historically. Something I've been kind of, mulling over in my head is this was never something that was stated in Premier Doug Ford's campaign trail. And that's something that critics have called him out on. Andrea Horwath mentioned it. Other critics have mentioned it as well. What are the implications of that for, in terms of talking about informed voters and knowing platforms, like what does this kind of teach us in terms of even just a lesson?
Yeah, this is one of the critics that the NDP leader brought up yesterday, and really this was Ford's style of campaigning through the whole campaign.
Share your insights with us. It's always a pleasure to speak with you about politics. So thank you so much. Stay tuned on TV. Tomorrow we will be interviewing MPP Ross Romano about his view on the notwithstanding clause. Stay tuned for more news coming up after this.